All right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, and I know we have a huge new audience doing just that today, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms and homes around the globe through over 40 free, live, interactive monthly broadcasts. Now, our typical audience is children around the globe. We do so many programs highlighting amazing speakers from across the world to them, but tonight we're doing a little bit of something different, and we are diving in on the first of our Nature Ideas series with the amazing Canadian Museum of Nature. I know the world's not really open right now, but for any of you joining us in Ottawa today or who have the chance to visit Ottawa, it is one of the most beautiful and amazing science communication hubs in the entire country, not to mention a sort of center for research that is one of the elite in all of Canada, if not North America. So we're in for a real treat today, and we had a huge audience register for today's program, over 320 people in groups from 11 provinces and territories, 15 US states, and a few international destinations to boot. So welcome in live, welcome in on YouTube if you're watching in later as well, and I cannot wait to get underway. So today's topic is one that is, I think, fascinating in its own right, and certainly for me personally, we are going to learn about climate change and mammal extinction in the age of humans. The word crisis is thrown around a lot. In 2021, it seems more apropos than usual, but climate change and biodiversity loss are two genuine crises that are affecting a lot of animals, wildlife, and humans on this planet right now, and have been in play for the last many thousands of years in some variety or other. So today we're going to learn from two amazing scientists about some of their work to chart those changes over the last few millennia and learn about how those impacts are happening today as well. Without further ado, I'm going to bring in our first speaker in just a second. We are joined live by Dr. Danielle Fraser. She is a paleobiologist and a director of the Beatty Center for Species Discovery at the Canadian Museum of Nature. Dr. Fraser studies the paleoecology and evolution of Cenozoic-era mammals. She's a paleoecologist and evolutionary biologist interested in how and why we have the mammals we do today and understanding how they might change while undergoing global change. Dr. Fraser is particularly interested in the evolution of hoofed mammals, studying their diversification, morphological, and dietary evolution during the Cenozoic of North America. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Fraser, and take us away.
Thanks, Jesse. And welcome everybody to our first Nature Ideas event of 2021. And we've got what I hope are really exciting presentations for you today. And I'm going to start out with talking specifically about climate change and what the past can tell us about climate change in the age of humans. And so today, the world, as you know, is dominated by a single, what we call megafauna species, and that's humans. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about megafauna? Well, I mean anything larger than 44 kilograms. That's 100 pounds. It's kind of an arbitrary cutoff, but it's one that we use to delineate things that are pretty big from things that are pretty small. And nothing shows the domination of the Earth by humans as much as this image. You can see just how numerous we are across the globe, you know, particularly in coastal regions, in Western North America, and in Europe. And the consequences of this global domination are global. And so I'm going to talk about those climate impacts. And so this is a map, and all you need to know is the red spots are places where things have I'm making mistakes now. All you need to know is that the red spots are where pressure from agriculture, from farming, is the highest. So these are areas where there's a high degree of farming and cattle and things like this. And this is associated with quite a boom in the production of methane. This is one of those greenhouse gases that we talk about quite frequently. Now, nowadays, most of the methane production from animals comes from domesticated animals, so things like cows. And today, with the dominance of humans on the globe, greenhouse gas emissions are ever increasing and are steadily increasing, particularly carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. And so that's what I'm showing here on the left. So this is just greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see here it's going up from 1970 through 2010. And as a result, atmospheric carbon dioxide has started to outpace carbon dioxide change for the last 800,000 years. And so you can see that in 2008, we were just around 400 parts per million. And now in 2021, we are at approximately 417 parts per million. And different scenarios for whether we try to curb fossil fuel emissions, whether we try to reduce, for example, the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by different industries, suggest that we could get quite a bit higher on that carbon dioxide scale. Well, why do we care about these things that we call greenhouse gases? Why are they called greenhouse gases? Well, when the sun shines onto the Earth's surface, some of that radiation is absorbed by the surface and stays in the atmosphere, and some of it is reflected back into space. But greenhouse gases are ones that reflect solar radiation back to Earth's surface and hold that heat in. And so the more greenhouse gases we have, like carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels and methane from those agricultural sources like cattle, the warmer things get. And the more heat is held in the atmosphere. And so the results have included substantial increases in mean global temperatures. And so you can see here from about 1850 to about 2018, the change in temperature. And since 1950, there's been almost a 1 degree increase in global temperature. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, 1 degree. We changed by more than that in Ottawa today. Well, you have to remember that this is averaged over the entire globe. And I forgot to tell you that the bottom there is cold and the top is hot. And so here I'm showing a map of the globe, and these colors are telling you where temperature has changed the most. So where it's red, the surface temperature has increased by the highest number. And so what this tells us that not only is global temperature increasing, but it's actually increasing more quickly at high latitudes as well. Why is this? Well, what has happened as the globe has warmed is a loss of Arctic sea ice and a projected continued loss into the 2050s. Well, why does this mean that Arctic places are getting warmer faster than the rest of the globe? Well, this is because when that solar radiation that I spoke about before, that heat that we get from the star at the center of our solar system enters our atmosphere, it is reflected away from the surface by things like snow and ice. But when you reduce the amount of snow and ice at those Arctic latitudes, what you get is increased warming. And in fact, the warmer it gets, the more ice you lose. And so we've all started seeing headlines like this. You know, Earth at risk of tipping into hellish hothouse conditions, and global warming may become unstoppable even if we stick to the Paris Climate Agreement. And of course, there are also headlines that I find personally horrifying, including decreases in the global beer supply due to climate change. And, you know, it all seems well and good based on the things that I've just said. We understand that climate change is happening. We understand that it's happening fairly quickly. And in most cases, we understand the causes. But still, there are numerous questions that climate scientists are asked. And so these are some of the things that I'd like to address today. And I'm going to directly address them. And so some of these questions take on the flavors similar to this slide. So here we have two pooches sitting in a nice winter scene talking about the weather. And one says, but I thought global warming were supposed to be true. And the other pooch says, it looks like our human lied to us again. Well, let's talk a little bit about the mistake that these pooches are making. Well, these puppies have made a considerable error in confusing climate and weather. And this is one of the most common things that people who study climate get asked. Well, it was cold this winter. How does that match up with what you're saying, that global warming is occurring? Well, Climate is in fact the average of weather of a place over a long period of time. And so here I'm showing the monthly average temperatures across the globe. And weather, so this is Ottawa's weather over the last several years. And weather is these red squiggles in this plot. These are the daily variations in temperature, rainfall, etc. in a single place over a very short amount of time. Like recent weather, where in Ottawa, we went from plus 20 degrees Celsius to -2 and snowing this morning. That's weather. So let's talk a little bit about that more. So weather and climate can be compared this way. Imagine walking a dog and your dog wanders at the limits of its leash, sniffing and exploring while you attempt to walk straight. Well, here you can see that the red line is climate and the blue line is weather. Ultimately, you both end up in the same place, but one meanders a lot more. And so it's important to note these differences. And what these pooches really should have been saying is it's particularly cold this winter, but it doesn't mean that climate isn't changing. And so these pooches have got a really good education there about the difference between climate and weather. But one of the other things that we get asked a lot are, well, climate has changed numerous times throughout the history of life. So why is today any different? Well, it's definitely true that climate has changed throughout the history of life. For example, 56 million years ago, this is approximately what Wyoming would have looked like. Now, if you've ever been to Wyoming or you've been to Alberta close enough, you know that this is a pretty dry grassland. It didn't have it doesn't have primates and giant Uintathirs walking around so much anymore. And then, by 20,000 years ago, we had very different environments. We had ice ages and we had mammoths wandering around even in Canada 20,000 years ago. Well, so why should we worry about it then? If this has happened many times throughout the history of Earth, is it actually different? Well, this is the main thing that I really want to talk about today. I want to talk about what we can say from the fossil record about whether today is different or just another pattern of climate change that's been going on for millions of years. Well, first I want to say a couple things about the fossil record. The fossil record is the outcome of what we call natural experiments. So that means that things like the uplift and weathering of mountain ranges like the Rocky Mountains that many out west will be familiar with and that I miss as a native Albertan. It's the result of speciation and extinction. So this is showing different species popping in and out over many millions of years. It's the result of species moving all over the globe. So as you know, species over the history of life have moved from one continent to another. And we can see evidence of this when we compare, for example, South America to Australia and their complement of marsupial mammals and of climate change. And I'm going to tell you a lot more about climate change. And the fossil record gives us a record of all of these things and all of the interactions of these effects. And today I'm just going to talk about what it can tell us about climate change. So let's talk about that. How can we measure climate change in the past? So some of you might know about some of these methods. We can look to ice cores. So ice cores preserve little bubbles of air that we can use to actually test for things like atmospheric carbon dioxide. We can also test for chemical patterns in those ice cores that tell us about temperatures. We can use the rings from wood, so we can get temperature estimates and drought estimates from these layers as the trees grow. We can get it from ancient fossilized soils. We can get ideas of temperature and rainfall. Pardon me, and perfectly relevant to my own work, we can get measures of climate from the teeth of the actual animals that lived during a period of time. So here I'm showing a pronghorn with some teeth that I drilled to get some chemical analyses done so I could get an estimate of the types of climate that some fossil pronghorn were living in. And this means that yes, I could take your teeth, your baby teeth, because I don't really feel like pulling anybody's teeth out. And I could tell you what type of climate you grew up in. So today I'm going to talk really specifically about things called foraminifera. These are very tiny little organisms that have a little hard shell inside. And these organisms live in the ocean, and they incorporate chemicals from the ocean that tell us about temperature. And so the specific things that they incorporate from the water that tell us about temperature are called isotopes. So these are not like radioactive isotopes. It's not like Chernobyl, where things like radium are giving off radiation constantly. These are called stable isotopes. And they can tell us about what temperatures the little shells inside these creatures formed. And in fact, they have a specific way of incorporating these isotopes that's a little bit different from terrestrial ecosystems. So anybody who works in terrestrial ecosystems will be a little bit confused. But generally, you'll find that when it was warmer, you'll find more of the lighter isotope, the isotope with 16 neutrons. And when it's colder, you'll find the heavier isotope, the one with 18 neutrons. And it's just a really great way for us to measure the climate that these organisms developed in. And so I'm going to talk about what's called the Cenozoic. This is the last 66 million years of the history of Earth. So the Cenozoic starts right about when the dinosaurs go extinct. So we all know a little bit about the asteroid that hit near the Yucatan Peninsula and wiped out all the non-bird dinosaurs. The Cenozoic also extends to now. So this is today, up at the top of that geological section. And you can see here a nice human-dominated landscape from New York City. So now bear with me. This is a talk about climate, so I have to show graphs. It's really hard not to. But I'm going to walk you through it as best as I can. So here we have what is called the climate curve for the last 66 million years. And don't worry, like I said, I'm going to walk you through this. Over here on the left, we have the 66 million years ago. That's when the dinosaurs went extinct. And here we have just about approximately today. And again, that's at the top of that section with the truck on top. And at the bottom, climates are colder, and at the top, climates are warmer. And again, this is data all based on those forams and their little tiny shells. And so there's a couple of things that we can say about this off the bat. The first is that over the last 66 million years, it has tended to get cooler. So we know that about 55 million years ago, it was pretty warm. And there were huge transitions during this time. So during the Paleocene and Eocene, there was almost no glaciation in the Northern Hemisphere. Whereas by the time you get to the late Miocene, Pliocene, and Pleistocene, you start getting glaciation in the high latitudes. So things like Arctic ice. And associated with these changes were major transitions in ecosystems. And so I mentioned that, the one on the bottom, again, looks very much like Wyoming did 56 million years ago. And by the time you get to the Miocene and the Pliocene, things start to look a little bit more like they do today, minus some of the creatures that we would not expect to see today. And animals changed quite a bit as well. So we had a transition from sort of smaller things, although Coryphodon, which is shown in the bottom, was quite large, to quite a bit larger things like mammoths and mastodons. But, there's other things that we can say about this climate curve. We can say that there were several periods where it got warmer. So there were at least 5 periods where we've had warm climates. And today I want to talk about 2. So I want to talk about the first one at about 56 million years ago, which is called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And then I want to talk about the Pleistocene. And this is the time period that a lot of people think about because they think about ice ages. And so are these different from today? Can we use these time periods to say something about what's going on today? Is it weird? And these time periods are also associated, just like today, with changes in atmospheric dioxide. So let's do some back of the envelope calculations. Let's see if we can actually do some math and make some direct comparisons to today. Well, let's look at the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This was about 56 million years ago, and it was a warming of about 5 to 8 degrees globally. So remember that I said a huge change today was 1 degree globally. This was a 5 to 8 degree global warming. And this occurred over about 20,000 years. And so you can see here, these are samples from teeth, just like I talked about before. You can see that it was cooler, and then as you get into that middle section, the PETM, it gets really warm. And this has been attributed to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So some has been attributed to the melting of these frozen balls of methane in the deep ocean, and also volcanism. So in some ways, it's comparable to today. There was increasing greenhouse gases. And there was also this really cool evolutionary effect. So we had, at the time, little tiny horses like Cypherhippus and Eohippus. And during that warmer time, they actually tended to get smaller, which was super interesting. But now let's get back to our back of the envelope calculations. Can we make some direct comparisons between today and the PETM? Well, if we calculate from 1950 to today, there's about a 0.02 degree per year increase in temperature. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot. Well, let's calculate that same number over 20,000 years, 5 to 8 degrees for the PETM. Well, this is 0.0004 degrees per year. Now, this is quite striking because the PETM is the warmest and fastest global warming event in all of the Cenozoic, not counting today. So when we compare to the warmest period in all of the last 66 million years, global warming is much faster today. And this appears to be outside the range of natural variation because, again, the PETM is the warmest period and it occurred much more slowly than we're seeing today. But let's talk about the last 35,000 years, the Pleistocene and the Holocene. This is the time period that a lot of people think about because it's mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed cats and, dire wolves and North American Arctic canids and wolves hunting Arctic Pleistocene horses. And if you didn't see the news, you should definitely check out some of the news coverage of my master student Zoe's new paper looking at how wolves managed to evade extinction during the late Quaternary, and the beautiful work by Julius Cittoni. Now, the late Quaternary is, well known for its transitions from lots of glaciation to less glaciation, and these are what we call glacials and interglacials. And now this is the exact same type of curve as I showed before. It's just for the last 5.5 million years. It's based on the same data. It's based on the little creatures from the ocean. And again, it's cooler on the bottom and warmer on the top. But if we zoom in and we look at data from some ice cores, we can see that we start to see those glacial interglacial cycles that we associate with the Pleistocene. So we can see here, we can see these interglacials, and we can see some of these, interglacials, and then we can see some of these glacials where we see these real changes from relatively warm climates to relatively cool climates. Now, there are a variety of potentially natural forcing mechanisms. These include, sort of eccentricity, the tilt of the Earth as it orbits relative to the sun's radiation, and precession, or the angle with which Earth is rotating on its axis. But I'm not going to go into detail into these to understand because a lot of work has gone into this, and that's not the topic of today's talk. But during this time period, we also see, and this is going to be the topic of Dr. Advait Jukar's talk following mine, that a large percentage of mammals go extinct, including things like the Irish elk, the giant sloths, woolly rhinos, mammoths and mastodons, and of course, saber-toothed cats. And from a climate perspective, this was also really interesting because if you look at data from ice cores, you can actually measure in those air bubbles methane in the air. And it turns out that when these large animals went extinct, there was actually a measurable effect on atmospheric methane. So before you go thinking that I'm talking about things coming out the back end, I'm actually mostly talking about things coming out the front end. And the extinction of megafauna may have in fact had an indirect climate effect as well through that drawdown of those greenhouse gases. And so if we also look at for atmospheric CO2 in these ice cores, we can see that it fluctuates quite a bit, you know, in a way that is fairly predictable based on the fact that we know there are several glacials and interglacials during the Pleistocene and Holocene. Sorry, late Pleistocene. And you can see that the highest value for the atmospheric CO2 is about 300 parts per million. Well, let's start doing our back of the envelope calculations again. So again, in 2021, we're at about 417 parts per million. If we compare that to the last 8,000 years, that last peak there at the end, there was only about an 80 parts per million increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. In contrast, over 70 years, there's been about 122 parts per million increase in carbon dioxide. Well, as with the PETM, even the late Pleistocene showed a slower rate of climate change than today, a slower rate of atmospheric CO2 increase. And it really does seem to fall outside of that natural variation, because if you look across the last 80,000 years, the highest we get is 300 parts per million, not 417. And so, you know, does it matter? Is today different? Is today just part of those natural climate cycles? Well, let's just quickly come back to the numbers. PETM, 0.0004 degrees per year. Late Quaternary, 80 parts per million in 8,000 years. And today, 0.02 degrees per year at 122 parts per million in 70 years. So I think it's quite safe to say that the rates at which atmospheric CO2 and temperature are increasing are quite a bit higher than the last 66 million years. Now, before I hand it over to Advait, I just want to transition to some of the things that he's going to talk about. Why do we want to study things, animals, during these ancient periods of climate change? Well, we can get an understanding of how animals respond to climate change. These include, how do their ranges change? How do they move across the landscape as climate changes? We can get an idea of how their physical characteristics change. You know, when it's warmer, do animals change in terms of their body form? We can get an idea of how the composition of animal communities changes. Do we have different animals when it's warm and when it's cool? And then we can get an idea, and it's getting older and older with some of the ancient DNA samples, we can get an idea potentially of how the structure, how the DNA and how the sort of genetic structure of species has changed. And hopefully by looking at the fossil record and looking at observations of today, like I've done in some of this talk, we can get a more holistic understanding of climate change. And so actually with that, I think it's time for me to hand it over to Dr. Advait Jukar.
Well, before we hand it over to Advait, I just want to say a huge thank you personally for that. What a great talk and so much fun. Yeah, I really, really appreciate all that. That was fantastic. The comments on YouTube are amazing. We've got so many people tuning in from across North America, so thank you so much for that, Dr. Fraser. And yeah, we'll dive in a minute with an intro for Dr. Jukar. Before we do so, I just want to say I've hosted well over 1,000 broadcasts over the last 5 years with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, and literally never once was there a more fun pre-broadcast banter on nerding out about science and nature and wild creatures as there was today. So I really appreciate both our speakers today. I think you get a sense from that first talk. It's a little bit more fun than a typical scientific talk, which is great. And we're prompting comments like this, Dr. Fraser. So I don't know who Chad is or where he's joining in from, but this is what happens when you highlight really cool wildlife, and it is awesome. So thank you so much to our really keen audience today. And let's keep it going with Dr. Jukar. So before I bring him in, I'll give him as much of an intro as I did for Dr. Fraser. Dr. Advait Jukar is a Gaylord Donnelly postdoctoral associate at the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies and the Department of Anthropology. He is a paleoclimate paleoecologist interested in large mammals of the last 20 million years, and his research is particularly focused on understanding the nature and consequences of megafaunal extinction, particularly in the last 50,000 years in South Asia, and on the ecology and biogeography of herbivorous mammals and dinosaurs in the Indian subcontinent and North America. I'm certainly fascinated, and so without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Jukar, and take us away. Oh, you're muted. The classic video broadcast thing.
There we go. It's a classic faux pas. I'm muting myself. Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Jesse. It's an honor to be here. And Dani, thank you for the introduction and a fantastic talk. I'm excited to talk to everyone here about extinct megafauna. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. So today I'm going to be talking about the megafaunal extinctions, which I would argue are the earliest sign of the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. We currently live in unprecedented times when one species, that's our species, Homo sapiens, dominates the planet's ecosystems. And our control over the planet's ecosystems have resulted in ecological catastrophes. And this has been caused by habitat destruction. It's been caused by rapid land use change to agriculture. It's been caused by overexploitation of the world's wildlife, like this mountain of bison skull that you see here from the American plains, from historical overexploitation of whales. And all of this continues on to the modern day, where we start seeing evidence of overfishing and poaching of vast quantities of wildlife for the illegal trade in wildlife parts. And all of this has resulted in drastic ecological change, most notably the collapse of the world's largest herbivores, and more broadly, the collapse of the world's ecosystems and populations of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish everywhere. Some of these collapses have even led some species to go to the brink of extinction, like the northern white rhino here. This is Sudan, the last northern white rhino male who died not that long ago, and conservation efforts are currently underway to try and resurrect this subspecies of white rhino. The vaquita is a marine mammal which is almost on the verge of extinction as a result of the trade in illegal wildlife parts. And our effect on ecosystems has been so profound that the vast majority of the world's biomass of mammals is now concentrated not in wild animals, but in us and the domestic animals that we depend on, animals like cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, and horses. We've reduce the populations of wild animals to the point where they're just an insignificant portion of the world's biomass. And this has led a lot of people to talk about how the way we're going would lead to an extinction event of the same magnitude as the big 5 mass extinctions that we've seen in deeper time. And this is oftentimes called the 6th extinction. But when did this extinction start? Did this start with colonialism in the 19th and 20th century, or with rapid industrialization? I would actually argue that to understand this extinction and this pattern of biodiversity loss, we have to go back to the landscapes of the Pleistocene, landscapes on our planet that were dominated by these giant charismatic mammals called the megafauna. Animals like the giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and large elephants. But before I start talking about the megafauna, I'm going to give you a brief primer on the Quaternary. The Quaternary period is the period of time that we live in. We live in an epoch called the Holocene, which comes after the Pleistocene. And I'm going to be focusing my talk on just the last 50,000 years of the Quaternary. This is where all of the action takes place. The Quaternary climate is characterized by these oscillating glacial and interglacial cycles, as Dani was talking about not that long ago. The cold glacials down there in blue are punctuated by warm interglacials, and we currently live in the Holocene, which is a warm interglacial part of time. And there have been about 25 of these glacial and interglacial oscillations. What you might typically think of as the Ice Age from the popular film Ice Age refers to the last glacial maximum or the last maximum extent of the ice sheets. The world during these glacial periods looked very different from the world of today, which is a typical interglacial world. Glacial periods were characterized by the spread of these massive ice sheets in the northern hemisphere, which covered most of Canada, parts of northern Eurasia, and you also had mountain glaciers down in South America and in Australia. And because so much water was locked up in the ice, sea levels were a lot lower and there was a lot of land that was exposed. For example, Southeast Asia is currently a network of islands, but back in a glacial period, it was a large connected landmass. It was also in the latest part of the Pleistocene, in the last 100,000 years or so, that our species dispersed out of Africa and then spread all around the world. And it's this story that I'm going to be talking about today and the impacts of this dispersal. Another characteristic of the last 50,000 years was that the world's ecosystems were dominated by large species. This is not something that we see today. If you think about the distribution of large animals like elephants and tigers and rhino and buffalo, they're largely found in parts of Africa and South and Southeast Asia. But not that long ago, you had animals like mammoths and mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and horses all over North America. In South America, you had elephant relatives like Cuvironeus, these strange hornless toxodons, which superficially look like rhinos or hippos, giant armadillo-like glyptodons, and giant ground sloths. Australia had some of the strangest mega beasts, like the giant wombat-like diprotodon, which got to about the size of a rhino, and the marsupial lion Thylacoleo. Northern Eurasia had the Irish elk, cave bears, the woolly rhino, and the very famous woolly mammoth. Parts of South and Southeast Asia had giant proboscideans called Paleoloxodon, which is one of the largest elephants to have ever lived. It weighed about twice as much as a modern-day African elephant. India had hippos. Southeast Asia had these massive tusked proboscideans called stegodons and giant tapirs. And even in Africa, where you still have large animals today, you had even bigger animals like Syncerus antiquus, which is the longhorn buffalo. On oceanic islands like Madagascar, New Zealand, and in the Caribbean, you had giant birds like the elephant bird and the moa, and large mammals like the human-sized lemur on Madagascar, and giant ground sloths in the Caribbean. But all of these animals disappear in a very short period of time geologically, which has resulted in this distribution of large mammals like we see today. So what caused this? And this has been a mystery that has been the focus of intense paleontological, archaeological, and ecological research for at least about 100 years. Now, paleontologists have come up with about 4 general hypotheses to explain these extinctions. The first one is anthropogenic activities, or basically what people do on the landscape. It can be hunting, it can be habitat change, it can be changes in fire regimes. The other one is climate or environmental change. Remember how I was talking about the oscillating glacial and interglacial periods in the Pleistocene? Some have hypothesized that these climatic oscillations may have done these species in. Others have suggested that there may have been an extraterrestrial impact, kind of like what we saw at the end of the Cretaceous, but at a much smaller scale. And others have postulated that a hybrid disease may have gone from species to wipe them out. So far, there isn't a lot of evidence for the impact or the hybrid disease hypotheses, but there's a vibrant debate that's raging in paleontological circles about the relative roles of anthropogenic activities and climate change in causing this extinction. But to understand this, we have to look at this extinction from a bird's eye view or from a global perspective. We need to look at the characteristics that we see all over the planet. And in order to figure out what's actually causing this extinction, these individual factors have to explain all of the characteristics of the extinction. So what are some of the characteristics of the megafaunal extinction? The first one is the large size bias. It's called a megafaunal extinction because large species preferentially go extinct. The graph that you're seeing there is a distribution of body weights among among land mammals. On the left, you've got the smallest land mammals, animals like shrews. On the right, you've got the largest land mammals, animals like elephants. And down here, shaded in black, are the mammals that go extinct in the late Quaternary or in the last 50,000 years. If I blow this up, you'll get a sense of just how big these animals were. The median size is about 182 kilograms. And most of the animals that go extinct in the Americas and in Australia all weighed more than about 100 kilograms. These extinctions didn't all occur at the same time. Different continents experienced different kinds of extinctions, and they didn't, and they were staggered. Most of them occurring in the late Pleistocene, some of them creeping into the Holocene as well. Africa experienced this smear of extinctions starting at about 60,000 years, continuing on into the Holocene. Australia and parts of northern Eurasia experienced some of the earliest extinctions taking place between 60 and 40,000 years. Northern parts of Europe and Russia then experienced a more staggered pattern of extinction stretching all the way into the Holocene. South and Southeast Asia experienced extinction starting at about 30,000 years, continuing on till about 8,000 years. And the most recent extinctions on the continents were seen in the Americas, starting at about 20,000 years and completing at about 6,000 years ago in South America. The oceanic extinctions all take place well into the Holocene within the last 2,000 years. These extinctions vary in magnitude across the world. What this means is that some parts of the world were hit harder than others. The Americas, Japan, Australia, and Madagascar lost between 70% to 100% of land-living mammals weighing more than 50 kilograms. Madagascar lost everything that was large, which is quite dramatic. Parts of Europe lost only about half of its large mammal fauna. North Africa lost about 30%. The parts of the world that were hit the least were South Asia, East Africa, and South Africa, which lost only between 10 to 15% of their large mammal fauna. So as you can see, some parts of the world were more adversely affected by these extinctions than others. Okay, so what we're going to do now is evaluate both of these hypotheses, anthropogenic effects and climate change. And again, in order for us to conclude that it was one of these effects over the other, they have to explain these three characteristics of the extinction. So let's look at the first one, the large size bias. We know that big things preferentially go extinct. North America doesn't have animals like mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths and giant camels anymore. One way scientists have looked at this is by looking at the odds or the chances that a species will go extinct if it is large. What you're seeing here in the left-hand panel are these odds ratios. Up to the top is high odds, down here by 0 is neutral odds. That means you sort of have an equal chance of going extinct if you're big or small. And down here is you've got low odds. The only point in the last 66 million years after the extinction of dinosaurs that we see high odds of going extinct if a species is big is in the last 100,000 years. And the only thing that was unique in the last 100,000 years that we didn't see in the deep time record of the last 66 million years was the presence of our species outside Africa. So from this, I can conclude that there's strong evidence that anthropogenic effects had a role to play in the extinctions. Because climate change has taken place in varied magnitudes throughout the last 66 million years, we can say that there's weak support for climate change as a driver of these extinctions, just based on large size bias. What about asynchronicity? Well, We know that the extinctions don't take place at the same time. So let's compare them with the climate record from the Greenland ice core, which is a good proxy for northern hemisphere temperatures. What you're seeing here is a squiggle of the oxygen isotope curve that Dani presented. Up on the top here is warm intervals, and down here are cold intervals. And in the last 60,000 years, we've got three particularly cold and dry periods. The first one is the last glacial maximum, which represents the maximum extent of the ice sheets. You've got Heinrich Event 1, which is a particularly cold and dry period characterized by these catastrophic droughts, which you see in South and Southeast Asia. And then you've got the Younger Dryas, which is a cold snap that occurred after Heinrich Event 1, after a warm period called the Bolling-Alrod. And as you can see, the extinctions don't seem to cluster in these particularly harsh periods of time in the last 60,000 years. What they do seem to map with is the arrival of Homo sapiens in these continents. People show up in Africa, or people evolve in Africa about 300,000 years ago, but then disperse out. And the pattern of the extinction follows the arrival of our species. I can illustrate this with this map. So again, people evolve in Africa. So our species evolves in Africa sometime between 300 and 200,000 years ago. And we're first seen outside Africa somewhere between about 120 and 90,000 years in parts of Western Eurasia and in parts of China. And our species is firmly established in Eurasia sometime between 60 and 45,000 years ago. And we dispersed down into Australia by about 65 to 50,000 years ago. And the extinctions in this part of the world all follow the arrival of our species. People reached the Bering Land Bridge between 30 and 25,000 years ago, and then dispersed south of the ice, for sure by about 15 to 14,000 years, but there are some older dates from some sites in Mexico and South America. And once again, the extinctions all take place after the arrival of Homo sapiens on these continents. Our species arrives on oceanic islands like Madagascar between 1300 and 1100 years ago, and the extinctions all take place between about 1,000 to 500 years ago. And the last place that people reach are the islands of New Zealand, sometime around 750 years ago, and the extinctions take place about 600 years ago. So as you can see, the extinctions all follow the arrival of our species. Furthermore, all of these species which go extinct had survived other warming and cooling intervals in the Pleistocene. And there's no reason to suspect that the last glacial period was any worse than these other glacial and interglacial cycles. So based on all of this evidence, I would argue that there's a strong case to be made for humans as a driver of these extinctions. Climate doesn't seem to explain this asynchronicity as well. What about the variable magnitude? So you're saying you've been talking about how humans have caused the extinction. So based on this, you would expect that places where people evolved or have spent a lot of time would show the highest magnitude of extinction, right? That would make logical sense. But that's not the pattern that we see. Places like Africa and South and Southeast Asia, where our species has lived for a very long time, actually show the lowest magnitude of extinctions. And even today, these are the places where we see large mammals, animals like elephants and rhinos and giraffes. So how does this make any sense? How does this explain this anomalous pattern? Taken at face value, you'd probably say that this provides weak support for humans as the driver of the extinction. But this is not the whole story. In places around the world where you still have large mammals, you actually have a long record of hominin occupation. What I mean by that is that we weren't the only species of humans to leave Africa. Humans left Africa about 2 million years ago, and there were multiple waves of dispersals out of Africa. And we know of 4 species for sure that left Africa. We have Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. Homo erectus or erectus-like hominins have been found everywhere from Turkey all the way down into Southeast Asia, and the earliest evidence outside Africa is about 2 million years. Homo heidelbergensis has been found in Germany, and we know that these hominins made spears that were used for hunting. Neanderthals and Denisovans ranged all the way from England all the way out into parts of China and Southeast Asia, and we know this from genetic evidence. And even in parts of the world like South and Southeast Asia, where we don't have a good record of fossil hominins, we have an excellent record of stone tools, which again go back to almost 2 million years. So in all of these places, we've had multiple species of humans coexisting and co-evolving with the fauna there. And this is the basis for the co-evolution hypothesis for the persistence of large mammals in Africa and Southeast Asia. And a very interesting pattern emerges. Places where multiple species of humans had interacted and had co-evolved with the native megafauna, places like Africa and Southeast Asia, experienced the lowest magnitude of extinction. Whereas places on the planet like the Americas and Australia, where Homo sapiens were the only species of hominid, experienced the highest magnitude of extinction. So the risk factor here is not only the presence of a hominid, and more particularly our species, but it's also the absence of other species of hominins and the absence of the amount of co-evolution that has taken place with the fauna. So does climate have any role to play now? So you're probably thinking that I made a very strong case for humans to cause the extinction, but what about climate change? All of these species are living in periods of climatic flux. And as Dani mentioned, climate change does have an effect on populations. Climate change can fragment geographic ranges. Climate change can cause populations to decline. And a good reason for this is because vegetation seems to track climate fairly well, and a lot of these large animals will then track their vegetation. Woolly mammoths, for example, were quite well adapted to these cold glacial environments, and these cold glacial periods were quite widespread across Eurasia. But in the warm interglacial maximum of about 126,000 years ago, they were restricted to these tiny pockets at the northern edge of the Arctic. What else makes these species vulnerable to extinction in addition to climate? It's actually the biology of being big. Being big is a good thing in many ways because it can make it such that you're vulnerable to certain predators, but it also means that you are bad at reproducing. Large species have long gestation times. They have long interbirth intervals. That means that it takes a long time between individual birthing events. Large species have small litters. For example, an elephant will just have one calf at a time, and large species take a long time to get to sexual maturity. All of these factors combined means that when these populations of these large species are stressed out because of climate change or because of something else, it takes them a long time to rebound. And so when humans encountered these large or these increasingly shrinking and fragmented populations of large species, it didn't take a lot of hunting pressure or habitat change to actually drive these animals to extinction. What I can conclude from all of this is that maybe we should leave these binary causal mechanisms and start reframing this question as, in the absence of humans, would you expect the same pattern and magnitude of megafaunal extinction? And so far, the evidence suggests that while climate and being big was necessary to make these animals more vulnerable to extinction, it was humans that were the last nail in the coffin. Climate change was necessary but not sufficient to cause the extinctions. The megafaunal extinctions are thus our first significant ecological impact as a species. And the extinction of between 10 to 100% of large mammals has irreversibly altered the functioning of almost all terrestrial ecosystems. And the sixth extinction, which we see taking place now, had deep roots in an Anthropocene that started about 50,000 years ago with the megafaunal extinction. And I want to leave you with a quote from Alfred Russel Wallace. He co-founded the theory of evolution by natural selection. And he said very famously in 1876 that we live in a zoologically impoverished world from which all the hugest, fiercest, and strangest forms have recently disappeared. And he was talking about the extinct megafauna, animals like the mammoths and the mastodons. But all hope is not lost. We still have large animals on our planet today that share this planet with us. And with sustained conservation efforts, we can make sure that our world is not impoverished anymore. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you all. And thank you so much for tuning in. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, fantastic, Dr. Jukar, Dr. Fraser. I'll bring you back in as well. This has been such a fun talk. You guys actually went before time. You went less than you had allotted, which is amazing, unheard of. Science talks, and everyone in the audience is still here, which also never happens for kids. So, literally, we have the same number at the beginning as we do after an hour. Way to go, audience. Way to go, you speakers. And I'm really excited to dive in with Q&A. So we've got over 135 people between Facebook and YouTube. If you guys want to start typing questions in the chat bar, we'll dive in with that. So please let me know where you're joining from, and we'll go from there. But I want to start on this conservation message. Before we get underway, one of the big questions we get from kids a lot, and I think it's really important when we talk about conservation, is what is your guys' favorite animal? Like, is there a favorite species for you? We were talking about this before the broadcast began about these special creatures. And I think that sort of philosophy, that way of looking at wildlife, is a nice springboard into understanding why they're so important to protect. So, Dr. Jukar, you just finished up, so I'll let you go first, and Dr. Fraser right after. Anything that really jumps out as really being special for you guys?
So I've always been a fan of elephants. I think elephants are these incredible animals. There are only 3 species left on the planet right now, but they play these crucial roles in ecosystems as ecosystem engineers. They knock down trees. They make sure that the savanna stays healthy. And they're just such fascinating animals with these complex social structures that are so similar to our social structures. I just find them incredibly fascinating, and they're a very special animal to me.
Yeah. Have you ever seen them in person? I'm curious, like in the wild?
In the wild, yes. I was in Kaziranga National Park in 2015, and I saw a herd of wild elephants at the same time as a herd of wild one-horned rhino, which is kind of crazy because it's one of the few places in the Indian subcontinent where you can see elephants, rhinos, water buffalo, and tiger in the same place.
How about that? What a cool experience, and lucky you. I think for any of our audience that have ever had the chance to see an elephant in the wild, it really does change your entire life. So thank you for that. Dr. Fraser, how about you? Anything that jumps out?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite animal is not something quite so exotic. It is a pronghorn antelope, not technically an antelope, so actually a member of their own group called the Antilocapridae. But they live in North America, and they get up into Canada in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, and they range all the way down to northern Mexico. And in fact, I have one tattooed on my arm, so I love them a lot. They're weirdos. They look really like they should be in an African landscape and not North America. Yeah. They are the fastest land mammal in North America, which always begs the question, why, given that all the fastest predators are extinct? And they're browsers. That means that they eat leaves, not grass, but they have very high crown teeth. And we know why that is. It's because they live in dusty environments, but they're just super interesting, weird hoofed mammals. And I wish they lived out here in Ontario and Quebec, where I live now, but they don't, sadly.
But very cool. What a unique answer. And by the way, Chad from earlier is big on your other pictures. Heck yeah for pronghorns. I think we can all agree they're a pretty spectacular animal. So for those who haven't heard of pronghorns, go check those out when you're done the broadcast. They're very, very cool. Dr. Jukar, this is a question from Andrew too. I'm going to bring it up on the broadcast for you to check out. By all means, take it away.
So Andrew Do asks, what is an effective way to test the co-evolution hypothesis, say, in Africa? Well, Andrew is a good friend of mine, and I know why he's asking me this question. So co-evolution is this really interesting hypothesis for which we currently have a lot of indirect evidence. One way to test co-evolution is to see if these declines in megafauna were taking place earlier in time or not. For example, do you see similar extinctions with Homo erectus or some of these other species of hominins that lived in East Africa at between about 2.5 million years to the present?
Yeah. Awesome. All right, Andrew, there you go. I like when colleagues put each other on the spot in live broadcasts. It's easier to do that way than the opposite. So way to go. I know Dr. Jukar did the presentation last, which means that there's going to be a lot more questions sort of readily top of mind for people. But if anyone has any for Dr. Fraser, please do share them. I actually have one for Dr. Fraser to bring her in, which is you talked about the fact that we have this really, really strong amount of data now on ancient climates and the fact that today's climate change is much faster than anything that we've seen in many, many years. So given that knowledge now, do you find a personal shift to want to talk more about, like, to tell that story, to highlight that climate change is not just real, but happening and rapidly, and it's really important to combat it? Or are you keen to dive back in and prove that in a deeper way? I guess climate change is a unique science where now that we have the data, I certainly, and we hear this from other scientists, feel compelled to use it to do some positive good. And I'm curious what your situation is in your career and with the information that you know.
Well, certainly it's not the first time that I've given that talk now. And I think that I like giving it because people ask these questions like, you know, is it the same as the past? Why do we think today's different? I put actual numbers on that. And I think that I want to continue doing that because I think that that's part of consciousness raising. That's part of getting people to see that it's not just another climate change event that's been happening for millions of years. In terms of my actual career, I mean, I have started focusing a lot more lately in the sort of later part of the Pleistocene. And this is partially because I think some of my questions are starting to aim towards what we call conservation paleobiology. So how can we use the fossil record to more directly ask and answer questions about today and about the future? And so an example of that is the study that Zoe Landry and I did. We looked at, you know, wolves in the Pleistocene and wolves today, and how did wolves make it through that extinction that Advait had talked about for a half hour, and why didn't things like short-faced bears? And so, yeah, I would say it has refocused my research a little bit, but I haven't lost my interest in the deeper time because I think it is relevant to understanding climate change today, just in a different way. Yeah. So what we can do with the deep past is say, you know, how did animals respond? Is that different than today? Or, you know, are we weird today?
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. Well, thank you so much for that. And you mentioned Zoe, so we're going to do the colleague put on the spot thing, keep it going. What do you consider to be a model organism for studying past climate trends, both ancient and present? And even if you've talked about this personally, for our audience that hasn't heard these conversations, please do share.
I don't think that I would pick out one organism in particular, but I can say some criteria that I think would make anything from a certain time period a good one to choose. So one would be that whatever tissue that you're going to sample actually reflects the climate. That's obviously important. And so the way that we test that often is we look to close relatives today, and we look to see, okay, their tissues are reflecting the things around them. And so we can reasonably go back and look at things that are closely related. We want something that's reasonably common in the fossil record. You don't want to use something that occurs at one spot in one place in time. You would like to get something that goes across a fair amount of time and a fair amount of space. And, you know, you would want their tissues So let's say you're interested in change in seasonality, you would want those tissues to be able to develop at a rate that would tell you something that you could sample and tell you something about the climate within their lifetime. So that way you would get lots of space, lots of time, and then lots of within an individual's lifetime, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. It's very, very cool. And I know our audience is a lot of academics today and people at institutes all around North America, but I must say, for me personally, it's such a pleasure to have people that are so much smarter than me when I do a broadcast. So that was very cool. So thank you for that, Dr. Fraser. Let's keep it going, guys. We've got Victoria McLeod. She's been asking a bunch of questions. I think this one's for Dr. Jukar. So I'm going to bring him back in. Do we know if the species that did disappear would have been more appealing? Are these particularly delicious animals that are going extinct, whereas the ratty ones aren't? Or how do we want to address that?
Yeah, so big herbivores in general are quite tasty. We eat them today as well. Animals like cows. If you're in some parts of the world, you eat horse as well. I like goat, sheep, and I'm sure animals like mammoths were quite delicious back in the day. So yeah, for sure, people were probably going after these species for food. Some of the carnivores which fed on the herbivores which went extinct probably went extinct as a consequence of the extinction of their prey.
Yeah. I'm really glad we brought up eating mammoth, and I'm sorry to mention this. We have a guy who's come on many of our broadcasts before named George Krunis, who's actually eaten mammoth. It was offered it by Russians when he was out in the bush. He made him very sick for several days. So maybe past mammoth when it's fresh is very delicious. Frozen 10,000-year-old mammoth, maybe not quite so much. Yep. I have a question for you personally, actually, and I picked this up in your slide deck. You highlight, like, the evidence that you present for humans being the cause of these sort of large mammal extinctions is pretty overwhelming. When you showed the mammal extinctions or the animal extinctions in South America, your timeline was 20,000 years ago is that they begin, whereas people are potentially getting there between 26 and 14,000 years ago. So since the line of evidence is so strong that people are causing these extinctions, could the extinctions in sort of the further past days, 20,000 years ago, be an indication that people were there if we don't have direct evidence of that yet? Like, could we use it to find that out?
That's a really interesting question and a very interesting way of sort of approaching this problem. I think some species are going extinct just because of natural causes, and they're being lumped into this because they're going extinct in the last 50,000 years. I think the bulk of the extinctions, though, all seem to take place after people show up. There are about a few species which go extinct between 20,000 and 14,000 years. I think most of them go extinct after.
Yeah. Very cool. Thank you so much for that. All right, we're getting more questions than I can possibly take. This is great. You guys are an awesome audience. I'm going to bring up one from Janet Harrison. Dr. Fraser, I'm going to come to you first for this one in a second, but I want both your opinions on it. How do you feel about rewilding of megafauna? Thinking about the UK, many mammal species such as bison coming back. What do we think about this as scientists with this background knowledge? So Dr. Fraser, take us away.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, and it depends on to what degree you're talking about rewilding. So, there are some people that talk about reintroducing bison to Banff National Park, and there are other people that talk about reintroducing Asian elephants to North America as an equivalent to mammoths. So those are two degrees of rewilding that I think I have very different answers to. One is that, there are certain areas that we could repopulate bison. I think there are going to be issues with any of these species, not bison specifically, with the amount of landscape that's now taken up with farming. And when it comes to things like repopulating North America with species that we think are functionally equivalent, I'm not sure that that would work in any way, just given they're not adapted to this environment. Humans are here taking up most of the space. And so degrees of rewilding, I should say. And I don't want to take too much of that answer from Advait.
No, but that's really, really great. Context too, we've actually done broadcasts on the Banff rewilding of bison, so on the Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants YouTube channel. If you want to see that actually take place in action, we have several broadcasts on that. And Dr. Jukar, before we go to you, you mentioned too this idea of de-extinction, bringing back the northern white rhino. And so it's interesting talking about these sort of really hardcore rewilding ideas and bringing species back, sort of possibly subtracting from basic conservation work that can be done probably at less cost. So I'm curious what your thoughts were. You were nodding along to most of Dr. Fraser's commentary there.
Yeah, Dani and I tend to agree about this. I think bringing Asian elephants and lions to the North American landscape is not the smartest thing to do when it comes to conservation. We have a lot of species on the landscape here that can be reintroduced to the national parks. Bison, for example, used to range all the way from Canada down to Mexico, but now they live in pockets. The same goes for wolves and bears, and we can bring these species back. The species that went extinct. They are never coming back. And that goes for all of these initiatives that are trying to bring the mammoth back. It's not going to work. And it's not a viable conservation option for the short term or even the long term. It takes up too much money, and I think we'd be better off if we spent the money that we have right now on saving the existing elephants and the rhinos and the hippos out there.
Yeah. I'm really glad to hear you guys be so definitive on this. It's something that I've seen in the past. A lot of people are there's a lot of nuance to it, but I think that's a really important message to share. So thank you so much for that. We're getting into the nitty gritty in some of these questions, guys. Again, fantastic audience today. Chad, who's been sharing so many fantastic things on Facebook. I think this is for you, Dr. Jukar. Any insights on anthropogenic impacts from data from biological isolates on islands like Beringia that may have not had hominin predators? You can both field this by all means. Dr. Jukar, you can lead us off.
Yeah, biological isolates, I'm going to assume that means these are just isolated mammals on the islands. So the Wrangel Island population of mammoths was isolated on these islands off the coast of Siberia for a long time. They were actually present when the Egyptians were building their pyramids. So there were mammoths on the planet coexisting with our species up until about 4,000 years ago. And they go extinct when people show up. There's a different island off the coast of Alaska. I think it's called St. Paul's Island, where it seems like the mammoths start to decline because of changes in the availability of water. Now, the whole thing with anthropogenic extinctions is that we don't have to go and kill off every single individual. We just have to kill off enough so that the populations decline. And we don't have to do this everywhere across a species range. You can kill them off in just a small pocket such that they can't go and repopulate the rest of the range when conditions become more favorable. Islands are also strange because different rules apply to them when it comes to extinction and evolution. Islands tend to be small, resources tend to be scarce, and so sometimes populations will naturally drift towards extinction on these islands.
Yeah, I'm really, really happy you brought up this context of not needing to wipe out absolutely everything. And we got this question on YouTube, and I've seen it before in conversations on this, the idea that, humans didn't surely butcher every single, mammoth. We didn't need to. If you kill a bit more than the wildlife, like the wild population would decrease naturally, eventually that species will go extinct because of that aforementioned long gestation period, low population size, and more. So I'm so glad we got that brought up. Dr. Fraser, do you have anything to add to that comment before?
I mean, I don't think I have anything to add. I think Advait's right on the money there. The only thing I would add is there were human predators, as far as I understand, in Beringia, and a bit earlier than the rest of southern North America. So they were there. That's where they came over. So
right, no, for sure. I think the earliest evidence of people in Beringia is about 30,000 years from, and then of course you've got people in Bluefish Cave, which are about 26,000 years.
Yeah, so they were there quite a while.
Yeah,
we are quite the adaptable and versatile species, aren't we? You mentioned islands off Alaska, and I need to do a shameless plug because I am watching Perfect Planet right now on BBC, and it's the first ever documentary series I've ever seen with the Aleutians, and some of the footage there was some of the most amazing natural history stuff in your life. So when you're done the conference tomorrow and you're done the program today, check that out because it's really fantastic. Dr. Fraser, this is for you from Peter M., who I'm presuming is probably a colleague of some kind because it's a very detailed question. So I'll bring this up for you. How ought climate change be modeled in the future? Should comparative analysis continue to be used, or are there emerging contemporary methods in development?
Oh, I mean, so this is a complex question for me as somebody who doesn't do a lot of that sort of future climate modeling. But the answer is that a lot of the methods are not comparative in the way that I did in my study. So what people have developed are these what are called general circulation models. And so these are models that, you know, bring in all the things we know about climate. So things like air pressure, water temperature. You know, I've even seen models with extra clouds, less clouds, more clouds. Like they can put in a variety of parameters into these models. And then what they put in is other parameters like greenhouse gas emissions, whether we reduce them, whether we continue on the same path, et cetera. And so a lot of the future predictions are based on that and less so than on the fossil record. And I have to say that the development in that area is much faster than I have kept up with. The new models are just getting more and more accurate. And what's really interesting, I think, is that a lot of the models are starting to converge on some of the same answers. And so when people, you know, sort of question these and say, well, they're models, they're not reality. Well, as we're starting to see them come up with some similar answers and starting to see them, you know, actually having predicted things 10 years in the past and things like this, I think we can have more confidence in them. But the short answer is yes, there are some pretty cool, pretty advanced methods for doing this stuff. And they basically simulate the Earth.
Which is just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I mean, even, whether it's weather forecasting, climate models into the future, into the past, I mean, the science today is so fantastic, even over the last few decades. You mentioned not being able to keep up with it quite the way you could have in the past, and that's a testament to the number of scientists, the number of amazing research institutes around the world that are doing this work. And I think that one of the cool things about climate change, too, and we emphasize this in our classroom programs, is when I was a kid, climate change was this hypothetical. We thought, you know, oh, you know, in 50 years, we'll start seeing this. And it's happening in our lifetime. If you're in Toronto, if you're in Ottawa, now Ottawa, the temperature does change 10 degrees every day, all year long. So you guys you don't really count. But the rest of us, you know, it's radical how much fires have increased, storms have increased in their magnitude, droughts and floods around the globe. We're seeing this in real time. And so it's a pressing issue for a number of reasons. But I'm
yeah,
really
and there are even new models that are trying to model some of those more drastic weather events. Yeah. And, you know, those are probably harder to validate. You know, I don't know from experience, but I'm imagining so. But
great question, guys. So thank you so much for this. I'm going to take another question. This is for both of you. We'll start with Dr. Jukar for this one. So this is from Alexandra Demers-Potvin, talking about sufficiently resolved fossil record, the scariest idea in science, that could indicate changes or stasis in megafauna body sizes. Are we close to getting this in the future, Dr. Jukar? Or
I just don't think we have enough time and enough sample sizes to get at this. From what I understand, species, well, and Dani can talk about this from the climate change view, but at least from a size decrease view in modern day systems, when we go after trophy animals, which tend to be larger, the average size in the population starts to decline. I don't think we have enough data on these extinct species and enough good dates to actually start to go and test these hypotheses out.
Yeah. Dr. Fraser, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Advait said about dates. I mean, I think we need to go out there and we need to date everything. And of course, that is a slow process because radiocarbon dates, which are only good for the last sort of 45,000 years-ish, are expensive. You know, they're about $500 per sample. But I think we could begin to test some of those things, like Advait said, if we had really good dates for the species that we were interested in. And then we might be able to narrow down, you know, was there any kind of evolutionary change prior to the extinction? And at this point, I don't think for most species that we can say that, like Advait said.
Very neat, guys. So thank you for that question very much, Alexandra. So we're getting near the end of the broadcast. Time flies when we're having fun, people. And we still have a really huge audience. I want to ask something personally again, which is you guys are both public-facing scientists. You're fantastic science communicators, and your work touches upon this change in climate over time and emphasizes humans impacting the world and biodiversity in such a big way. Have you faced any pushback on this work, whether from colleagues, whether from the general public? I mean, this is something that never should have become a controversial issue, but has obviously become one in science in the world. Dr. Fraser, if you want to kick us off, anyone ever, I don't know, called you out on the things that you talked about scientifically?
I think the majority of the time, no. So most people who I interact with are already kind of the converted, right? And so that is part of the thing that happens with science communication, right? We get people who show up who already believe that climate change is real or know that climate change is real. But occasionally I have had people approach me, and it's not always about climate change. It tends to be a little bit more about evolution just in general. And that's more of the questions that I've gotten. But from a professional end of things, more so on the nitty-gritty details, less so than the overall picture, if that makes sense.
No, that's perfect. Dr. Jukar, you?
I think there's still this debate going on in the megafauna extinction community about whether it was people or climate. I think the archaeological community tends to favor climate more than people. There are all kinds of these old issues about the blitzkrieg hypothesis about human exploitation, which most of us don't take very seriously anymore. And I think that's been where I've gotten the most feedback about. But beyond that, as Dani said, it's about the small details about like the quality of the dates, or about is this taxon even a valid taxon anymore? How many cave bears do you have? Do you have two, or do you just have one? And that can impact your extinction estimates.
How many cave bears do you have is a question only at scientific conferences and programs. Fantastic one. For anyone who's not had that question asked in life, it's a fantastic one. Guys, this has been so much fun. I want to give you guys both a chance. If there's any sort of overarching message you want to wrap up the broadcast with, I'm going to leave us all on the screen together. Dr. Fraser, if you want to kick us off, anything that if people are going to take away one thing from your presentation today that might lead them down new avenues where they want to learn more, what would that be? I
would say, if you take anything home, it's that climate change today is not just part of a cycle or a series of cycles that's been going on for thousands or millions of years. It does fall outside of that natural variation. And there are ways that we know that it is the result of humans. And so that's really what I wanted that message to be from my talk.
Yeah, fantastic. Dr. Jukar?
I think I would like people to take away the idea that there is no pristine, there is no untouched ecosystem, because human impacts on these ecosystems go back 50,000 years from the extinction of the megafauna. But I also want to give people a message of hope that we still have large animals there on the planet today, and we can take steps to make sure that they're still here for future generations.
Yeah, those are some fantastic messages. I mean, as someone who loves science communication, loves books and documentary series, it's so nice to get to hear these things from scientists in a live context. And I think our audience, certainly their questions, their interest, their enthusiasm has reflected that today. I'd like to stress, you guys in your presentations highlighted so many great resources. The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. Project Drawdown is a fantastic book about climate change and human impacts on it. XKCD is an amazing and really approach for science communication. And you highlighted Neil deGrasse Tyson in the Cosmos series, which is just one of many incredible series, BBC, PBS, TDO, and more, that are highlighting these issues in a really broadly accessible way. But if people want to find out more about you specifically, because I'll do it so you don't have to be vain, you can see more about Dr. Fraser at her website below. You can see more about Dr. Jukar at his website below. And if you want to check in on tomorrow's amazing program all day long, I think it's 8:30 to 5 p.m., check out nature.ca/biodiversity. Dr. Fraser, I know you're involved with this directly. Dr. Jukar, I don't know if you are actually coming in as a speaker tomorrow, but should be a fantastic time regardless. And then if you guys want to follow up with our whole Nature Ideas series, again, this is the first program in this epic series. Check out exploringbytheseat.com/special events/nature ideas, your unwieldy URL of the day. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys. Dr. Fraser, Dr. Jukar, it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Have a wonderful